Hi everyone. So today we are going to finish up chapter 31. We're going to go over section 4. Let's just do a little bit of review. Remember section 1 that was talking about the movement towards integration, and that's where we get all this nonviolent civil disobedience, sit-ins, people riding buses, the Freedom Riders, marches. All of that ultimately led to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And then in section 2, there was the effort to get voting rights, which leads to the Voting Rights Act of 1965. I'm sorry, this is my dog. She's making a lot of noise. In section 3, there were problems with the movement, as we know, and one of the greatest was the death of Dr. Martin Luther King. But there was also that growing Black nationalism. We get the Black Panthers, the Black Power movement, the Nation of Islam. So this section right here talks about the movement continues, and many people would argue that it continues on to this day. So let's go ahead and get through this. Okay, so following the death of Dr. Martin Luther King, Ralph Abernathy takes over as the head of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and he continues on with what they had planned with the Poor People's Campaign. Because remember, first they were going for integration, then it was voting, and then the movement focused on economic equality. So what they did, they wanted to draw attention to the fact that the government was spending all of this money on other things, specifically the Vietnam War, and they thought that the attention should be given to the nation's poor. So they were going to do this march to Washington, and Abernathy continued this. They go to Washington, they set up this like makeshift town with tents and everything else. They called it Resurrection City. It failed miserably. There was rain. It was real muddy and everything, and then the police in DC evicted them. Here you see some pictures of Resurrection City. Notice that it wasn't just African Americans. White people got involved in this too, kind of wanting to draw attention maybe not to just Black poverty, but also white poverty. On the right there, you see a civil rights leader. That's Jesse Jackson. Okay, another thing that occurred, we had that growth of Black nationalism, people who were seeking to have their own nation within the territorial boundaries of the United States, and rather than integration, they wanted segregation of their own, right? So this sort of idea diminished as time went on. One reason for it is that there was counterintelligence activity by the United States government against these groups, right? Because they were fearful that some people were trying to separate our country. There's also a drop in donations because a lot of people who were working for the civil rights movement were also protesting against the Vietnam War, and some people who maybe might have opened up their pocketbooks saw this as an affront. It was unpatriotic and un-American and unseemly at a time when people were going off and dying, who were drafted and dying in war. Also, we see the unification of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee with the Black Panthers, who had advocated violence, right? So this happened under Stokely Carmichael, right? And so he was expelled from SNCC, and then SNCC just kind of diminished. Also, Malcolm X was the figurehead for the Black Muslims, but once he was killed, there were fewer people who wanted to join that organization. So all of that just kind of dwindled away. As you know, though, the Black Muslims are still around today. So are the Black Panthers, for that matter. So following the Civil Rights Act of 1964, many lawmakers around the country sought to integrate schools, right? And to do that, what they did is they employed this method called busing, and it's really very simple. You take Black kids from Black communities and bus them into white communities, and take white kids from white communities and bus them into Black communities. I know this firsthand. In 1974, my parents decided to move from our small little town in Hermiston, Oregon, where there were no Black people at all, and we moved to Fort Myers, Florida, and we lived in this white neighborhood. And my sister and I were bused into the Black neighborhood, and then the kids from that neighborhood were bused throughout the city to go to other locations. I don't recall my parents ever really talking about it. The one thing that they couldn't understand is why we didn't go to school right down the street where there was a neighborhood junior high. So they were upset about that. To the left here, it shows basically riots that broke out in Boston in 1974 when that state chose to bus students, right, to integrate the schools. And so they were taking kids um, from the black neighborhood and busing them into South Boston, and the people in South Boston were not happy about it. What ended up happening is a lot of affluent, some wealthy white people would take their kids out of the public schools, or they were moving into the suburbs, right? And so it wasn't just a matter of black kids sitting next to white people and white people sitting next to black people in the schools. What it was is that typically the schools that are more affluent are better, right? Because they have more money, more resources, and that sort of thing. And historically, in the United States, people who are black live in poverty. We've talked about that in our classes, right? We've done the poverty exercises and everything else. So those schools are not as well equipped, and historically they haven't been as good. And so this was a way of giving black students the same opportunities as white students, but there was huge white backlash from that, and it erupted in violence. To be honest, neither side was very happy. I put a link here to a video which explains what happened in Boston in 1974 and how it just erupted. A lot of that tension that's going to break out throughout the country was subsided somewhat with the Supreme Court case Milliken versus Bradley, which we're going to talk about in just a minute. Okay, when we're referring to the Supreme Court, if you recall, Chief Justice Earl Warren had overseen a lot of the civil rights legislation that was coming out. And, you know, it all was due in part to the Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas court case, right? So the South is not happy with him. They want him impeached, all of this stuff. As this is going on, he was appointed by Eisenhower in '52, but he retired in 1969, and Warren Burger then becomes the new Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, who's going to be the Chief Justice when some of these other Supreme Court cases are going to be heard. All right, so the Supreme Court case we were talking about before is Milliken versus Bradley, and I need to put a year on that. Sorry about that. I'm not exactly sure when it was, but this had to do with busing. But what the plan was here was in Michigan. So the state decided, or Detroit decided, that they were going to bus their kids out into the suburbs, right? So you know that the tax base is different. So the people who live in Monticello provide the funding for our local schools, and the people who live in Champaign provide the funding for their schools. So that would be like Champaign busing their kids here, or vice versa. So the people in the suburbs were not happy about this, and so it went to the Supreme Court by a narrow decision, 5-4 decision. It was ruled that the suburbs were not responsible for paying for the education of people from Detroit. So there were some dissensions on this, meaning some justices who didn't go along with it, and one of those people was Thurgood Marshall. So Thurgood Marshall, remember, he argued the Brown case on behalf of the NAACP. He was appointed to the Supreme Court by Johnson, and he was the first black man to do so. He's going to end up leaving the court in 1991. He was ill, and Clarence Thomas would be appointed by George H.W. Bush, and he is still on the court, and he's only the second black person to ever serve on the Supreme Court. Okay, so some other things that people started to do in order to align with integration and the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is they wanted to try to level out their hiring practices, because, you know, it was illegal to base your hiring on race. And so what they employed was something known as affirmative action. Now, I underlined on here the word preference. When you give preference to one group of people based upon their ethnic status, right? So oftentimes we're looking for black people, we're looking for white people, that sort of thing, you're going to give them preference, right? This was a way of trying to advance I don't know, socioeconomic mobility of Black people and other minorities in the United States into the public arena, right? They did this because the Justice Department started to investigate businesses, corporations, if they were not hiring Black people. So this was a way of trying to protect themselves and make sure that they had diversity within different businesses or schools, right? Universities. All right, here's one too, Griggs versus Duke Power Company. Duke Power Company was having people take a test, a specific test for advancement into various jobs, right? And sometimes when we look at tests, they can be biased one way or another. And so this person believed that it was biased, and so this goes to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court upheld affirmative action and saying that you can't give a test unless it shows there is just cause for the test, right? Yet you can't just do that to try to weed people out, right, as a way of doing that. So what then companies started to do is create quota systems. So a quota is a fixed number of jobs for a specific area, right? So, and oftentimes they would want it to reflect the community. So if you say a community has 70% white, then 70% of your employees should be white. If it has 20% Black, then 20% of your employees should be Black. So trying to do those sorts of things to make sure that your numbers represent a good equal balance of what is in the community. So don't get affirmative action and quotas confused. Affirmative action, it looks at preference. When you're doing affirmative action, oftentimes you have set numbers. So the quota is the set number. All right, this one was a highly controversial Supreme Court case. There was a guy by the name of Alan Bakke, and he applied to the University of California Medical School, and he didn't get in. And he argued that he didn't get in because there was preference given to people of different races, and he said that that violated his rights and that it was basically reverse discrimination. And the Supreme Court agreed with him, right? So in this case, they struck down the quota system. This has been very controversial, and it's been happening throughout the country where people kind of argue this back. Thurgood Marshall again dissented here. He said the dream of America as a great melting pot hasn't been realized by the Negroes because of his skin color. He never even made it into the pot. So what you see today, there's a discussion about people being privileged, right? If you're born Black in the United States, if you are born into a poor family, if your parents are divorced and you're in a single parent home, some of those things make you to where you are not privileged, right? So that you kind of are an underdog and you can't get ahead. And so people argue that there is no such thing as reverse discrimination, that some people who are privileged in society have more opportunities, and therefore you need to advance the role of others by affirmative action. So that is why this has become very controversial. So Bakke won his case. He went to the University of California Medical School, and he did go on to become a doctor. Okay, so there were some successes for the movement, and this is our last slide. You can see this here. Carl Stokes, he was elected, the first Black man elected to a major U.S. city in Cleveland, Ohio. We also get Black people coming together and forming a huge voting bloc, right? Once Black people have a say through the ballot, then it's beholden to white people to try to get their vote. So you have to make laws and regulations that might favor that community, right? And we see this here. They're taking political action. There's the National Black Political Convention. This was in Gary, Indiana in 1972. And look at that, 2,700 Black delegates with 4,000 attendees meet. So that starts to show that the Black community is a huge voting bloc in American politics. If you look right here too, if the election of 1976, this one, Gerald Ford was running against Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter won by only 2 million votes. Now, 6.5 million Black people came out to vote. Had they not come out to vote, had they not been able to vote, Jimmy Carter probably never would have been elected president, but he got the majority of the black vote, excuse me, in that presidential election. And what we were seeing too in recent years as well is that the black population in the United States is the most rapidly growing middle class in the United States, and then also there's an increase, and this number continues to grow as well, an increase in the number of black-owned businesses. More black people are being appointed to executive positions in many companies in the United States. So hopefully we'll see this trend continue to where we won't think about race anymore. Anyway, thanks for listening, and talk to you soon.